Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ingenious Talks Online, Urban Flood Resilience, Advancing Safe to Fail Infrastructure. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Kilpatrick, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's event. While we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to acknowledge the Algonquin Nation, whose traditional and unceded territory we are gathered upon today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Together, please consider how we are and can each, in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We will now go through a few event items. So this is a Zoom webinar, which means that all attendee microphones and videos have been automatically disabled. However, there is the option to ask questions by typing in the Q&A box on your screen. So while questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation, we highly encourage you as they come to mind, type them as they come to mind into the Q&A box on your screen. So you do not need to wait until the question and answer period to submit your question. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, but please be mindful that with a high volume of questions, we cannot guarantee that all will be answered. You may also type into the chat box on your screen to talk amongst each other and share ideas. Finally, a brief survey will appear on screen at the conclusion of the webinar. And if you have the time, we'd really appreciate if you fill it out. We welcome and appreciate your feedback, and all answers are anonymous. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Yeowon Kim. Dr. Kim is an assistant professor in urban systems and environmental engineering at Carleton University. Her research focuses on advancing urban infrastructure resilience to extreme weather events and investigates ways to mitigate the impact of urban flooding and its consequences by advancing resilient and safe to fail infrastructure system design, stormwater management, and nature-based solutions. Today, Dr. Kim will present ways to develop safe to fail infrastructure that depart from the current practice of risk calculation and manages failure consequences when flood risks overwhelm the existing infrastructure systems. The safe to fail approach connects to urban sustainability, where city practitioners deliberately think of and include the future cost of social, environmental, and economic attributes in climate adaptation planning and decision-making for extreme weather events. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for joining us today. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the talk today. So today I'm going to talk about how we can advance safe for infrastructure system, which is an emerging concept developing urban resilience to climate extremes, and especially for how safe to fail infrastructure can contribute to increase and improve urban flood resilience. As Laura introduced, my name is Yeowon Kim. I'm assistant professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Carleton University. So before I start, let's think about what is a city. So the word city was derived from the Latin for citizen and originally meant a community of citizens. And then in the book of Triumph of the City, the Edward Gesser defines cities as the absence of physical space between people and companies, and they are proximity, density, and closeness. So this minimalist definition of cities by Glaser well represents some of the cities that we have around the world right now. And throughout the history, people have been attracted to cities as centers of culture, learning, and economic opportunities. But urbanization also has costs, especially when it happens rapidly, with the rapid development, increased population, dense population, and also environmental hazard risk. And some of today's largest cities are home to more than 20 million people, and other cities are growing at an unprecedented paces and potentially hazardous rates. In modern days, cities have become residential, political, cultural, and economic environmental, and technological hubs. And their urban forms have been diversified, such as planned city or the urban sprawl that you can see in these photos here on the left. And then on the right, we see a conceptual map of Ottawa showing a proposed gold belt where the areas in yellow and which would limit the urban sprawls through 2100. So this shows that different forms of cities have been evolved throughout the history, and sometimes it has been planned with a specific purposes. And these contemporary cities are shaping economy and develops towards being more energy intensive, more service-based, and more broken up and into the modern days. Many of these cities around the world are located in areas relatively high climate hazards along coastlines and rivers in water-stressed regions. And as human population and built infrastructure are densely aggregated, cities are especially vulnerable to extreme weather risk like floods, extreme heat, drought, and heat waves and hails. And adverse impacts of those climate hazards in cities are likely to be exacerbated due to the complexity of anthropogenic changes in urban environments, which are projected to increase both in frequency and magnitude. And each year, these weather events, including floods and extreme heat, wildfires, windstorms, and those other destructive thunderstorms pose a serious risk to cities across Canada. And these events are growing and causing an impact such as economic losses, mental, psychosocial stresses, and in some cases, fatalities. Although each city faces a unique combination of climate change related to challenges, flooding has become the most widespread and costly natural disaster across Canada, and it is likely to be one of the most impactful weather events that will cause climate-related infrastructure damages in Canada in the coming years. And many of you might be familiar of these devastating flooding events happened in Ottawa-Gatineau area in 2017 and 2019. The left picture shows the flooding events happened in 2017, which led to mandatory evacuations in the affected areas and flooded over 5,000 homes in Ottawa-Gatineau area. And the city experienced another major flooding in 2019 after 2017. And as you see, and as you might heard, the flooding not only causes physical damages to infrastructure systems and buildings, but it also incurs socioeconomic damages such as business disruptions and loss of homes, as well as ecological damages such as habitat losses. And recent climate studies find that extreme weather events are driven by changing climate variability and more greatly due to human activities in urban areas. And however, it is impossible to say that anthropogenic climate change caused a specific weather event because there is always natural variability plays a role in these extreme weather events. However, what we can still examine from climate science and climate data is that how much of weather events has been intensified or weakened due to climate change from the historical observations. And so you see the observed change in habitat precipitation around the world, whether it was increased or decreased or remained the same. Or there's some places there is not enough data to have the projection or have the observation of the changes. And this here you see the observed changes in annual precipitation in Canada, which you can see that some areas has been intensified in terms of their precipitation annually, and some areas have been remained the same, more or less the same. And in addition to this, projection of future climate tells us that the recent trend towards increased heavy precipitation events will continue. So to repeat, annual precipitation has been intensified or increased or decreased in some areas, but there are common trends around the world that heavier precipitation will likely to be intensified in some of the already impacted regions. So climate change is expected to result in shift in the location and timing of rain and snow across the Canada. And the intensity and frequency of floods are projected to increase with these changes. As temperature rises, warmer air can hold more moisture, and therefore, in a warmer world, the hydrological cycle is expected to become more intense, which more rainfall concentrated in extreme events and longer dry spells in between, which can increase the impervious rate in urban land covers and which also can lead to intense runoff, more runoff generated from the rainfall. And at the regional scales, these changes in climate are expected to cause streams to shift from nival, which is snowmelt dominated streams, towards more pluvial streams, regimes, which are more rainfall dominated. For example, climate change played a role in the extreme rainfall events that contributed to the 2013 Calgary floods and the 2014 and 2017 Ottawa floods. Thus, as going into the future, urban infrastructure role isn't just limited to utilizing resources and providing public services. In the past, infrastructure have been built to utilize natural resources like gas and coal and considered as means for economic development. And more recently, an important role of infrastructure in urban area is that to provide protection from climate hazards like extreme rainfall or heat and mimic the natural systems to minimize the environmental perturbations. And the goal is that our goal in the climate change era is that cities need to develop and manage infrastructure systems to be more resilient to adverse impacts of those extreme weather events. So when we talk about climate adaptation, we often hear about the concepts of resilience, which I'm going to mention a lot during this talk. So what is resilience? So resilience is defined as system ability to experience surprises and shocks while retaining function, structure, feedback, and capabilities. And the resilience capacity enables a system to respond to changing conditions, so there are minimal losses to the system and maintaining its essential functions. The strength of the resilience capacity of a system is that it can help systems to develop adaptive capacity and robustness into the system, so the system can gracefully weather the inevitables or unspecified system shocks or stressors. And also resilience capacity or the ability of resilience of system helps to build social and natural capital and enhances adaptive capacity of certain system to cope with unknown futures. And the reason why the resilience capacity of a system is important in addressing climate risk is that we are living in a world that are affected by non-stationary climate, which means that the weather events are not well predicted by the normal distribution from the past weather or climate data. For precipitation event, for example, changes in the mean and variance from the normal distribution can affect the different aspects of predicted extreme events or heavy precipitation, including the intensity of heavy rainfalls. And as you see on the right graph, Canada is not an exception from this non-stationary climate trends. We have observed that in the last few decades, the annual average precipitation has been well above the annual average precipitation, well above the normal reference value from the 1961 to 1990. And when we look at the regional patterns, these variabilities from the normal distribution are even more varied from the historical data. So the challenge of urban areas in addressing climate risk and adapting to climate change under non-stationary climate is that infrastructure systems that are designed to protect the city from climate risks are still failing and causing damages in urban areas due to unpredicted risks. As you can see in this picture, cities have built and upgraded infrastructure systems such as levee system in New Orleans, and then the large-scale storm drainage system in Houston, following the engineering criteria and based on the calculated climate hazards. However, these systems have failed responding to extreme weather events, even with the advanced calculations and engineering design practices. And I see the biggest impediments to the design and management of these robust infrastructure systems are not a lack of technological solutions or the technologies that is needed for designing and developing these systems, but it's more because of an incomplete understanding of vulnerabilities within urban systems that encompasses social, ecological, and technological systems, and the difficulty in choosing the most appropriate solutions for resilience and long-term sustainability. So current infrastructure development practices have been remained largely unchanged in the past several decades. These robust traditional infrastructure systems have been designed to be large, gray infrastructure with low probability of failure and to be lasted for decades. And it is often oversized to comply with the safety margins and to avoid any possible failure from calculated risks. However, traditional infrastructure design practices are rigid and do not reflect the changes in the profile or frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, and it makes it difficult for cities to rehabilitate the infrastructure, and therefore it is likely that those failure of those current systems is likely to increase going into the future. So this is a typical process of infrastructure development. You first identify and establish the decision context with identified hazards, and then you calculate and analyze the risk that might be posed in certain region. And then you evaluate the risk based on historical data. And then you make the risk management decisions by deciding which type of infrastructure that you will be implement for addressing this specific risk. And then based on regulations and design specification that are required for a certain system, you construct the infrastructure by building safety threshold and safety margins into the system. So until now, cities have designed and operated the infrastructure system under the models that emphasize control against predicted risk that follows this type of process. And these systems often aims to be a fail-safe system, which I'll discuss more in the next slide. Cities have been designing, upgrading an infrastructure based on design return periods, for example, a 100-year storm event. However, as climate projections expect that these 100-year events are happening more frequently, infrastructure failures against those unpredicted hazards or even predicted hazards are becoming increasingly likely going into the future. So to explore different infrastructures' adaptive capacity for resilience, we need to pay attention to current systems that are designed fail-safe, as I mentioned in the previous slide. And this fail-safe system tends to have rigid system properties, so does really very little adaptive capacity to accommodate and respond to changes in the environment. Fail-safe systems are effective because they are built to be robust against the calculated risk. However, risk evaluation has two components: probability and consequences. And the fail-safe design focuses too much on the probability and very little on consequences. As such, they are limited in incorporating the shifting urban environments and changing climate conditions. So when these systems fail, as you can see in this photo, the consequences of the failure are usually catastrophic. So we need to understand now, why do these systems that were calculated that was built based on the calculated risk still fail? So these fail-safe infrastructure are designed to be robust near normal events. However, the above normal extreme events are increasing due to climate non-stationarity And this was from 2018 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook. And if you look at 2021 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook, you can see that above normal hurricane events are predicted to be increased as going from 2018 to 2021, and these trends are projected to be increased going into the future. So while recognizing the limitation of fail-safe approach, cities started to think about a reversal way of designing infrastructure system by accepting failures, which is safe-to-fail approach. For example, in the Netherlands, the Netherlands have been experiencing chronic flooding problem due to the heavy precipitation and increased elevation of the streams and rivers. But instead of building higher and higher levee system, which cost a lot of money, they decided to increase the floodplain and then gives more room for the river to be flooded when there are increased and heavy precipitation events. And then this approach of safe-to-fail thinking and giving more room for the river to be flooded when there's heavy precipitation allows them to have more adaptive capacity when there are unpredicted hazards, especially unpredicted heavy precipitation events that can cause the large amount of flooding that might not be might not be protected from a certain elevation of the levee system. So this safe-to-fail, where this safe-to-fail concept has stemmed from. So this concept of safe-to-fail has stemmed from 3 study disciplines, which are urban planning, safety science, and resilience engineering. Urban planning approaches emphasize small-scale innovations with expectation of minor failures. So failures in this sense is an experience that can be useful in the future and where the failure impact can be naturally observed in the ecosystem. And specific examples that demonstrate this perspective are green infrastructure and low-impact development practices such as bioswales and urban tree canopies that provide redundancy to storm drainage systems in urban areas. And the safety science perspectives that you see on the middle argues that reducing risks and adding safety barriers are necessary to contain the impact of infrastructure failure within design system tolerances. And failure in this sense means that service disruptions, and thus these studies tend to focus on system recovery practices. And particular examples that illustrate these perspectives are underground nuclear waste repositories and dam spillways that you can see here, that dam and have a spillways and having a secondary spillway that builds the redundancy to the system. And lastly, in the resilience engineering perspective, the risk-based approach is further questioned by advocating for a resilience-based approach that requires the understanding of social and technological system interactions through the repeated and iterative process of sensing the risk, anticipating the risk, and adapting to the risk and learning the risk from failures. So based on previous studies on system failure, here I'm going to redefine the safe-to-fail approach and safe-to-fail design approach for infrastructure development. Currently in the infrastructure planning, we often focus on the risk that are directly posed to infrastructure, such as heavy rainfall and urban systems. For example, here heavy rainfall can be a primary risk and primary hazard that is directly posed to the urban system. And I define this direct climate hazard as primary risk. But there is a secondary risk that we need to consider in making infrastructure development decisions, which I define here as secondary risk that arises as an outcome of failure or implementation of an infrastructure itself for an identified risk. And my question is that how can we develop infrastructure systems that manage the consequences of failure and the secondary risk, which might happen when infrastructure itself stops providing its intended services and causes social, economic, and environmental impacts? And my answer to this is that we actively make decisions for infrastructure failure mechanisms in the design and development practices. So a system may lose function in a controlled way, which I define as say-to-fail infrastructure here. And in this way, different types of failure consequences are experienced as expected in the planning, and even it will be experienced as the failures will be experienced as planned even when safety thresholds are exceeded by unpredicted risks. So this safe-to-fail approach is in line with some of the infrastructure resilience concept that has emerged with the needs for more adaptable infrastructure design that are resilient to changing climate. So Dr. Woods, who is a renowned infrastructure resilient research, has proposed 4 different concepts for infrastructure resilience, which are rebound, robustness, graceful extensibility, and sustained adaptability. And safe-to-fail approach is an emerging infrastructure planning and design approach that focuses on these 2 infrastructure resilience capacities that create agility to handle surprises. The primary idea of safe-to-fail approach is that we as engineers, planners, and municipal policymakers governing infrastructure systems should design infrastructure systems in consideration of their systemic failure and the possible consequences. And this approach embraces these 2 resilience capacities among 4, which are graceful extensibility and sustained adaptability. And these emphasize abilities to extend existing system performance when surprise events challenge the current capabilities and current systems, and to manage the trade-offs and build more adaptive capacity to continuously evolving risk context. And the potential benefits of safe-to-fail design and infrastructure development approach to adapt to unpredictable climate risk brings us additional decision dilemmas, brings us as planners, engineers, and city practitioners an additional decision dilemma to infrastructure development. To design infrastructure system for managing failure consequences, stakeholders and decision makers need to make explicit decisions on who will be experiencing the consequences and how the possible impacts might be prioritized to be managed from failure. And I describe this dilemma of designing for failure as an infrastructure trolley problem, which is the dilemma of prioritizing the consequences of infrastructure failure that may be experienced by different social, ecological, and technological system attributes in urban areas and by different population in a city. And these decisions raise additional societal and ethical questions regarding whom and what should be prioritized to remain safe when infrastructure systems are failing. So, and to answer this question and to answer this decision dilemma, one approach to this is that to consider not only the estimation on direct tangible costs that are currently considered in traditional infrastructure development decisions, we also need to think about and take consideration for social losses, business interruptions, and intangible costs such as environmental losses and health impacts, which requires decision makers to understand the various social, ecological, and technological system adaptive capacity of a region and a possible infrastructure failure impact that might affect those different capacities. And this can be done by engaging with different stakeholders that are involved and who are identified in infrastructure by the risk analysis and and planning decisions. So to repeat again, the key strategies in fail-safe design is calculating the risk and usually oversizing the system to accommodate the safety margins and safety threshold in the system. So, but in safe-to-fail design, the key strategy is to engage with multi-stakeholders to actually identify what are the different adaptive capacity of a region to a certain risk. And if the infrastructure system itself fails, what are the consequences and what different people and how different risk and impact might be experienced by different populations. So for example, a fail-safe approach for a drainage system in Mexico City has resulted in oversizing the pipes that accommodate the combined sewage. But in Netherlands, the Room for the River project was done by engaging with different stakeholders who were in the flood-prone regions, and then by discussing with them for the possible adaptive capacity and by relocating them away from the floodplain region to expand the spaces for the rivers to be flooded when there are high intensity precipitation and storm events. And one example in Canada, which shows another safe-to-fail approach, is that interdependent infrastructure system management approach in mud-based Surrey in British Columbia. So this example shows the safe-to-fail approach that incorporates the various flood risk impacts in the planning stage for interdependent infrastructure system management, and this was done through various stakeholder engagement. So in this situation, the flood hazards included inundation of a network of regional infrastructures, including water and sewer lines, roadways, highways, which were servicing more than 200,000 daily vehicle trips across the floodplain, and also green infrastructure systems that were delivering critical ecosystem services, such as the wetlands that were located in this area. And also the nationally significant economic activities were exposed to those coastal and pluvial flood risk, which also included transportation corridors and the good movement along the railways, as well as the primary British Columbia hydro connections to the power authorities in the state. And because of the shared understanding of climate risk was developed, there, and the understanding of this different risk that might be posed by flooding hazards was developed by Engineers of Canada Public Infrastructure Engineering Committee, and they included a triple bottom line assessment to identify the social, environmental, and economic impacts and drivers that are common amongst the owners and then the stakeholders. And because of the distributed benefit of conducting this assessment, the funding for those infrastructure development projects was also initiated through the coordination among the different and various municipalities that governed these different infrastructure systems, which was critical to foster cross-institutional collaborations. And although these influences on decision-making varied across the different organizations and institutions, the positive public perception, which are also key to safe-to-fail infrastructure development, was also a key concern for many asset owners, and it also have helped to bring this project in real life. So it could happen due to this across different stakeholders and shared responsibility, as well as understanding of climate risk that were posed to those infrastructure systems. So now, with this understanding of theoretical approach of safe-to-fail design, I did a study in Arizona, Phoenix, to apply those theoretical findings of safe-to-fail design in practice and developed a coupled systems model to evaluate infrastructure's capacity and what are the possible adaptation solutions for urban flood resilience that are affecting the city. So for this study, we used a case study of city of Phoenix, where the exceeded capacity of the drainage system often results in major and minor roadway flooding and traffic disruptions. And this is not just the case of Phoenix, but it is often the case for urban flooding in many different cities. And to evaluate the risk of urban flooding by extreme rainfall, we myself and a number of collaborators who were working on this project projected a 100-year event which happened 2014 in Phoenix into the future, in both near and far future terms for 3 different climate scenarios, which are hot and dry, medium change, and warm and wet scenarios. And then these projections were provided by the EPA stormwater management model climate adjustments tool. And the results showed on the right, results showed that there are increasing trends of extreme rainfall in both future terms, both near and the far future, and in all 3 scenarios. And with this future precipitation data that shows the increased intensity of increased intensity of flooding events in urban areas, we ran a hydrologic rainfall model to using the EPA stormwater management model to run the 100-year storm event and simulated this into the drainage network model for Phoenix to identify where are the most intense flooding locations from the drainage overflow. And then we combined the flooding intensity results with the traffic volume data to integrate the potential impact of drainage functional failure on urban systems. So by combining, so for example, if a drainage system overflows due to heavy precipitation event and due to the limited capacity of the drainage system, it can cause the traffic service disruption in certain roadways, and then we identified this by calculating the annual average daily traffic and combine this with the flooding volume. And by combining these 2 indicators, we could map the vulnerability of roadways to flooding in Phoenix area, and we could identify where are the most vulnerable locations to urban flooding impacts. But more interestingly, what we found from this study is that if you compare the interstate highway with the local roads, the flooding simulation results shows that the local roads are expected to experience more intense flooding, almost 5 times more than the interstate highway. However, if you combine this flood risk volume with the traffic volume data, the infrastructure vulnerability graph shows that the interstate highway and the local roads have the similar vulnerability level and similar level of impact on systems from flooding because the interstate highway accommodates much more traffic volume than local roadways. So this shows that only if it design and develop infrastructure system only based on the flooding calculations, it might result in more impact and more cost in urban areas because it does not account the possible infrastructure failure and their consequences in urban areas. For in this case, the traffic volume was the indicator that shows that how the failure of infrastructure might affect the urban areas and the cities in terms of their daily service operations. So with this results of flooding vulnerability and possible failure impact in urban areas, we wanted to incorporate the stakeholder perspective to make these results and to put these results into actual decision-making processes. So first step that we did was to identify 19 different resilience strategies from the literature that can be applied in infrastructure planning and that can highlight different adaptive capacity of a region. And then to come up with different stakeholder perspective, we came up with 7 different stakeholder perspectives from the literature, which emphasize different adaptive capacity or the resilience strategies for each of the perspective. So as you can see, the first perspective shows the equal distribution of importance of 19 resilience strategies. And the second perspective, which focused on fail-safe design, only focuses on armoring, strengthening, oversizing, isolation, and fail silence, fail operation. And others are also varied in terms of how they see infrastructure system, how they see resilience strategies should be applied in planning and development. And then we assess the 26 climate change adaptation solutions to produce a list of 31 distinct roadway flooding mitigation solutions, such as processes or certain technology or system design consideration. So for example, a curve cut is useful technology for reducing small volumes of flooding on local roads by directing water to nearby foliage, but these are less useful on major roadways with multiple lanes that can carry much larger volumes of water. So now we know the different perspectives that highlight the different regions' the capabilities and strategies. And also we know that the interstate highway and then the local roads are the most vulnerable roadways in Phoenix area. So with this combined information, we use the multi-criteria decision analysis model to present what are the best solutions for the case of Phoenix if different stakeholders have different preferences on resilience capacity, where it could help towards mitigating flood risk for interstate highway and the local roads. So both the roadway vulnerable results and then the flood management solutions that are commonly used in North America, which was already evaluated by resilience capabilities strategies, were combined to come up with the adaptation strategy scorecard in Phoenix area for urban flood resilience. And then the result shows that the solution rankings vary depending on how you interpret the concept of resilience and how different stakeholders identify the different adaptive capacity for urban flood resilience. So for example, if you consider resilience strategies that are focused on developing fail-safe system, you could have solutions like flood storage and multi-span bridge structures to be most effective for mitigating flooding for interstate highways and local roads in Phoenix area. But if you are a stakeholder who put emphasis on resilience strategies like multifunctionality or the adaptive design to develop more safe to fail system, you can see that vegetated bioretention basin or the activated floodway comes up high in solution rankings. So this shows that with the same climate risk analysis result, if the different stakeholders have different perspective and if the different stakeholders have different capacity to climate risk, the solutions that comes up as the best mitigation methods or strategy can be different based on how different stakeholders input their perspective or their involvement in decision-making processes. So we in this study we have identified additional decision-making processes such as identifying infrastructure failure mechanisms and values and equity consideration when establishing the decision context, and also including climate projections when analyzing the risk. Also adding the infrastructure vulnerability analysis to actually account for the infrastructure failure. And also different resilience strategies to incorporate different stakeholder perspective, and then the knowledge system that were provided by different stakeholders. And with these additional approaches to the current infrastructure development practice, we can actually develop safe-to-fail infrastructure that can effectively manage the consequences of a potential infrastructure failure when these systems are faced with unpredicted climate risks. And in conclusion, here you see two of the most renowned safe-to-fail infrastructure for flood control: Room for the River project in the Netherlands and the Indian Band Wash in Scottsdale, United States. And the foundational idea of these two safe-to-fail infrastructure system is that they design a system so the city can live with water. And here you notice that a safe-to-fail strategy embraces the social and ecological capabilities as well as technological system capabilities in developing infrastructure systems that are usually technocentric and that are usually based on enhancing the system capacity focused on technocentric design criteria. However, actually to enhance the system and the regional resilience to climate hazards, we need to actually incorporate both the social and ecological, and in addition to technological system perspective, to increase the overall adaptive capacity to climate hazards. In other words, safe-to-fail infrastructure planning requires decision makers to understand different social, ecological, and technological system interactions to decide where are the trade-offs that are made for achieving the overall systemic resilience goals. So this social, ecological, and technological systems view of urban systems is necessary to uncover the synergies and conflicts of different social, ecological, and technological systems, which I call here SETS lens. And then the safe-to-fail approach directly challenges this, directly incorporate this SETS perspective and challenge the isolation of the technological domain, which are currently dominant in infrastructure planning and development practices. And more broadly, safe-to-fail infrastructure necessitates a recognition that these SETS domains are interconnected and interdependent in operating and managing infrastructure systems for addressing climate risk. So therefore, by applying these safe-to-fail approaches, infrastructure managers and city planners and engineers must identify known and anticipate unknown risks and disturbances to infrastructure systems through the SETS lens and manage any potential failures. So lastly, what I want to say is that with the continual technological innovation and growing complexity of urban areas and shifting demographics, and also the changing climate, urban systems, especially infrastructure systems, are likely to become more increasingly challenging. And moving forward, it is important to understand the role of built infrastructure in mediating the relationship between human activities and ecosystem processes to improve the urban resilience in various climate risk and various climate adaptation decision contexts. Not only for urban flood resilience, but for urban resilience for other kinds of climate hazard as well. And this motivates my future work in continuing to employ inter and transdisciplinary approaches to conduct more solution-oriented research, which can enhance the understanding of infrastructure resilience and also co-develop knowledge systems for climate adaptation with communities and practitioners, and also advance the theories of sustainable and resilient urban systems development. So this wraps up my talk today. I want to acknowledge the two research networks that I am part of, which are first Natura project, which is nature-based solutions for urban resilience in the Anthropocene. Here we with 36 networks around the world working on nature-based solutions, we address how the nature-based solutions can help mitigate the various climate risks around the world in different regional contexts. And the second one, USSRM, which is Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainable Research Network, which we had 10 different cities in North and Latin America to work with city practitioners and the researchers to envision the futures that are resilient to climate risks. So that is all of my talk today, and thank you, and I'll be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. Such an interesting presentation. So if you're interested, you may submit questions through the Q&A box that's on your screen. I don't think we'll have time for all of them, but we'll make sure that Dr. Kim gets a copy of those after this webinar ends. So feel free to submit. But our first question here, so what are the barriers of implementing safe to fail infrastructure approach in practice?
Okay, that is actually a really good question. There are several barriers in implementing this safe to fail practice, safe to fail theory and design into practice. First will be the data availability. To actually identify the risk and then potential consequences of infrastructure failure in different urban areas, we need to have different kinds of data. So for example, for flooding risk, we need a map of drainage system to a good, well-defined map of drainage system to simulate the flooding risk. And also some of the topographical data is also needed to identify where the low-lying area that might create the ponding in urban areas. So first will be the data availability. And the second will be a gap between the practice and researcher collaborations. So often, researchers are working in their silos and their researches are not well delivered into practice to work with practitioners. So the second challenge will be that how we can actually deliver these new emerging concepts of safe to fail to practitioners so they can actually actively incorporate those new way of thinking infrastructure design in their practices, because practitioners are the actual the workforce who design and implement those infrastructure systems to mitigate the climate risk. And then I guess the last point will be that how we can balance out and how we can actually identify by the stakeholders who needs to come into this decision process, and who will provide the information of different adaptive capacity that different regions or different cities has in this safe to fail infrastructure planning processes.
Great, thank you. So next question. So are there any nature-based solutions or projects that can be adapted by volunteer citizens and organizations at the neighborhood level?
That's a really good question. So I think so safe to fail, I see the safe to fail design can be both great and the nature-based solutions if it actively incorporates the failure consequences into the in the decision-making and planning processes. So for nature-based solutions, for example, having the bioswales and then green spaces that can be used as recreational areas for normal days, but then when there's a heavy precipitation event, it acts as a secondary drainage system that accommodate lots of overland flooding from the roadways or the surface area. Can be one of the nature-based solutions example, which increases the green spaces that provide ecosystem values to the city, as well as also can act as act as a mitigation system for flood risk as well.
So next question. So in terms of cost, how much investment is needed to upgrade current fail-safe systems to safe to fail?
That is actually a really good question, because the investment and the funding is a key issue in infrastructure sector, not just for Canada, but also across different world area. And then the challenge is that, if we want to just renovate the entire fail system that we currently have in practice and have in operation in cities, that will cost a lot of money, because it will take, removing the current system and rebuilding the system. That's why we also need to think about the hybridity of the safe to fail system, that, how additional system can be added to the current system to actually increase the adaptive capacity of the system failures. So for example, the drainage systems, the storm drainage systems are most common flood mitigation measure in many cities, but not just investing in drainage system to make it more increased capacity, or to make it greater pipeline sizes to accommodate more flooded water. We can think about adding other systems like bioswales, or having the rains harvesting system to actually mitigate the runoff that is generated from precipitation and that flows into the drainage system. So the cost can be saved by diversifying the investments. And then I think the main cost that will be more the challenge in implementing safe to fail system is more on the time invested in the design and planning processes, because it requires active involvement of stakeholders, which is always not easy in planning processes.
So I think we have time for one more question here. So just a side note, there's been lots of comments saying very interesting presentation, and thank you. But this question, so as an expert in the area, what are the most important vulnerabilities our infrastructure face or experience locally, so in Ottawa?
To be honest, I recently moved to Ottawa, so last year. So I myself have not experienced the great intensity of Ottawa spring floods yet. So I think the most important vulnerability is for the Ottawa area is on the interdependency of the different infrastructure systems. So the flooding not only causes damages directly to residential areas and the land uses and land covers in urban areas, but it also causes impacts and create the vulnerability to other infrastructure systems like the wastewater treatment plants or the transportation system. So for example, we have two main wastewater treatment system in Ottawa area, which is connected through one single road to the city center area. And these roads, because those wastewater treatments are located near the river, this one road that's connecting to the wastewater system are often flooded during the springtime. And then this one road is critical to operating the wastewater system, because the vehicles deliver chemicals and then other materials that are needed to treating the wastewater. So I think the most vulnerability that's caused by flooding in Ottawa area, except the physical damages in residential and housing area, will be the interdependency between different infrastructure systems and the propagated vulnerability due to flooding.
Thank you so much. So that's about all the time we have for today. Just wanted to thank you for joining us if you're in the audience, and a big thank you to Dr. Kim for sharing your insight and information and your research. We're just going to pop up a quick survey. If you do have time to fill that out, it would be most appreciated. All answers are anonymous. And then also on the screen, you can find ways to stay connected with the Faculty of Engineering and Design. We hope to see you at our next talk, which will be in May. So stay tuned for details for that. So thanks for joining us today. Stay safe and well, everyone. Thank you.